filling in tonight. This is Melinda, and Melinda, you are on.
Oh, thank you so much, Duane. As Duane was saying, my name is Melinda Holm. I am the new director at the Crested Butte Museum. I just started in the end of May, so this is really exciting to be part of this series. We'd like to welcome you all to the 5th episode in this series about Colorado history with the Dr. Duane Vandenbusche. This program will be recorded and available on our webpage, crestedbuttemuseum.com, or on the YouTube page, Crested Butte Mountain Heritage Museum. There we also have multiple series that the museum has hosted available for you to watch at any time. If you weren't on earlier, we did have a hiccup with last week's recording. Zoom is trying to help us locate it. It was saved. We just don't know where it went after that point into cyberspace. So please bear with us and we'll probably have a report next time. But this one will be going live or on the pages next week. The series does take a little time to coordinate and to work and to produce, and we are able to make it a success because of you, the museum members, those who donate, and those who are sponsors. If you'd like to become a member or make a donation to help this series still maintain, you can go to our webpage, crestedbuttemuseum.com, or just stop at the museum or give us a call at 349-1880. And we'll give you everything you need to enroll. By doing this, it also helps us keep our doors open at the museum to create all kinds of educational programs, exhibits, and opportunities for us to share with the community and all of those in the Gunnison Valley. Our gracious sponsors tonight for this series are Western Colorado University Foundation, Bill Petros, who is one of our board members, and Bud with Bluebird Realty, located on Elk Avenue in Crested Butte. The museum will be observing some new hours beginning next week. We will be closed on Tuesdays and on Wednesdays. So literally open Monday through Wednesday, probably right now 11 to 5 p.m. But check out our webpage or give us a call before you come to visit. We'll keep everything updated there. The week of Thanksgiving, we will be open 7 days a week again, and we will gladly welcome you for the holiday season. Our walking tours have also come to an end with the season, but we are also coordinating any kind of private tour you may like, or be it outside or inside the museum, or whatever you want to tour around our area. Just give us a call and we'll coordinate. We update our webpage and all our social media outlets. That's Instagram, it's Facebook and TikTok, whenever there's a new event or some kind of special announcement that we want to share with all of you. So please check it out. We'll have time for questions at the end of Duane's talk. You have to post them in the chat box. And don't forget to take notes to win the trivia question, which we all look forward to at the very end. So get your pencil and your paper ready. We have a lot of photos this time around, and I'm going to do my best to make sure that they match up. And they will give you all kinds of historical information about the railroads of Colorado. So over to you, Duane.
Thank you very much, Melinda. We are going to start off with the railroads in Colorado with a little background and talk briefly about railroads in the United States. The United States doubled its territory from 1846 to 1848. In the Oregon Treaty of 1846 with England, we picked up Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and a little bit of Wyoming and Montana. 2 years later, at the conclusion of the Mexican War in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the U.S. picked up the Southwest. We got California, we got Utah, we got Nevada, and we got the Colorado below the Arkansas River in the southeastern part of the state. So we added a lot of territory. Many Americans headed west in the 1840s, and they were headed for rich valleys like the Valley of the Willamette in Oregon and the Puget Sound Trough in Washington and the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys of California. Then came the California Gold Rush of 1848 and 1849. Melinda, I think we're way ahead of the game there. We need to go back to number 1. Get the photos. Should be a wagon train in there. Yeah, we're all the way back to the start. Yep, there we go. We got it. Thank you, Melinda. California Gold Rush of 1848 and 1849 brought thousands of Argonauts heading west seeking riches. But there was one big problem as those people moved west. There wasn't any easy way to get here. It was 1,966 miles from Missouri River to Oregon and about the same distance to California, over a barren, arid, mountainous, and dangerous land. Many trails were followed by people going west, including the Oregon Trail, Santa Fe, Mormon, and California trails. They were all long and dangerous, with Indians a constant problem, along with disease like cholera, which killed thousands. Other routes to the west included going from the East Coast by boat all the way down the East Coast and all the way down to the tip of South America, the Straits of Magellan, some of the worst water in the world. And then up the West Coast to California or Oregon. And that trip took 9 months, and it was very expensive and very dangerous. Another route took one from the East Coast by boat to the Isthmus of Darien, today's Panama Canal. And then one walked or boated 76 miles from the Atlantic to the Pacific side through mosquito-infested swamps, and then up the west side to California or Oregon, if one had a boat waiting for him or her on the west side. All of the routes to the west took many months. All were very expensive. All were very dangerous, and many travelers never got to their destination. What was needed was a safer and better route, and this began the saga of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1853, Congress appropriated $150,000 for 4 railroad surveys from the Mississippi River to the West Coast. The Secretary of War in charge was Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, later on the head of the Confederacy. When completed, the best route theoretically would be chosen. In the north, the northern route, Isaac Stevens looked over a route from Duluth on the west end of Lake Superior to the Oregon country around Seattle. In the south, Billy Park looked over a route from New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi River to San Diego on the west coast. Emil Whipple followed a south central route from Memphis on the Mississippi River to Los Angeles. And the fourth great explorer looking for a railroad, a possible railroad route, was Lieutenant John Williams Gunnison of Goshen, New Hampshire. Gunnison followed the 39th parallel from St. Louis heading for San Francisco, went through the Gunnison country and was stunned by the Black Canyon and the Lake Fork and what Antoine Robideau had referred to, if everybody will pardon me, as son of a bitch hills, the Blue Mesa, and of course, Cerro Summit. Very difficult to go over. Gunnison was killed by Paiute Indians in southern Utah in October of 1853. And the following year, Lieutenant E.G. Beckwith completed his route to San Francisco. The possible route for a transcontinental railroad now became very controversial, with both the North and the South wanting their routes. Then came the Civil War in 1861, and the Transcontinental Railroad was put on the back burner. 1 year later, however, the North approved the Pacific Railway Act, which sanctioned the building of a transcontinental railroad after the war. Following the war in 1866, the construction of the railroad began in earnest, financed largely by the federal government, which gave out subsidies and also gave railroad companies land on either side of the line, the famous checkerboard system. So not only did they get the land, they also got the water rights and the mineral rights, 1 square mile on either side of the tracks. In addition, the government paid the railroads so much a mile for building the line. $8,000 a mile in the Great Plains, where it was easy building, all the way up to $64,000 a mile in the Sierras and the Rocky Mountains. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad went on from 1866 to 69, and there you see a Union Pacific engine. The Central Pacific built out of Sacramento, California. The Big Four, Leland Stanford, of Stanford University fame later, Mark Hopkins, the accountant, Collis Huntington, the engineer, and Charlie Crocker, the construction man, were the key men of the Central Pacific. The Union Pacific would build west out of Omaha, Nebraska, and they would be under the direction, or it would be under the direction of General Grenville Dodge. It used Irish laborers, while the Central Pacific employed Chinese. And there you have the building near Weber Canyon in Utah. Charlie Crocker, the construction boss of the Central Pacific, in the face of incredibility and hostility, used Chinese, even though they were little fellows, weighing about 110 pounds. Crocker was tired of Anglo workers who signed on to work and then got a cheap trip out to the gold and silver fields and then left without any work. There is the excavation, and you can see it's all handwork on the building of the Union Pacific line, and now you're going, starting to get up into the Rockies. The Chinese proved to be tremendous workers, chipping away by hand at tunnels, laboring in heavy snow, and hanging out over cliffs in baskets to drill dynamite holes. They also never got sick. And they never got sick because their favorite drink was boiled tea, with the boiling water obviously killing all of the bacteria. On May the 10th, 1869, the rails met together at Promontory Point, Utah, completing the nearly 1,800-mile first transcontinental railroad in U.S. history. And there the engines are nose to nose on May the 10th, 1869, for the driving into the Golden Spike. The great Western writer Bret Harte wrote a poem about the joining of the rails, which went like this. What was it the engines said? Pilots touching head to head, facing on a single track, half a world behind each back. Colorado, however, was not on the transcontinental line. There was no good low mountain pass over the divide. There were tremendous canyons and very difficult terrain, and in the winter, there was a tremendous amount of snow. The Transcontinental Railroad ran through Cheyenne, Wyoming to the north, went over South Pass at about 8,000 feet, and Denver, they said at that time, was too dead to bury. Everybody thought Cheyenne would be the metropolis of the Rockies. Despite the bad news, Denver and nearby Golden fought to gain railroads. William Loveland, the town father of Golden, was first. In 1868, he began the Colorado Central Narrow Gauge. And there you see it, running up Clear Creek Canyon. Ran from Golden west to Georgetown and eventually to Black Hawk and the Central City area. Loveland hoped to tap the mining wealth of those great mining regions, and he also dreamed of a railroad that would run even further west. And there again is that narrow the gauge Colorado Central up Clear Creek Canyon, the first railroad in Colorado and the first narrow gauge railroad in Colorado. David Moffett was another dreamer who wanted Denver on a transcontinental line. He accomplished this with the Denver Pacific Broad Gauge Railroad in 1870, 2 years after the Central. He built a branch line from Denver about 95 miles north to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where now he had a tap in with the Transcontinental Railroad there. Georgetown miners donated a silver spike to mark the finish of the Denver Pacific. Meanwhile, another broad gauge, the Kansas Pacific, built into Denver in August of 1870, arriving from Kansas City. The real railroad action, however, began in 1870 with the starting of the famed Denver and Rio Grande, owned by William Jackson Palmer. Palmer was a Quaker born in Delaware in 1836. He served in the Civil War, rising to brigadier general, became a director of the Kansas Pacific, and now he dreamed of his own railroad. Palmer married a 19-year-old girl named Mary Queen Mellon of the famous Steele family in Pennsylvania, and on his honeymoon in London, saw in the paper that a man named Robert Fairley was giving a talk to the British Locomotive Association entitled Rails of the Future. Palmer sent his wife on a shopping trip and attended Fairley's talk. he heard Fairley talk about narrow gauge railroads, which were little known in the US. He declared that narrow gauges with tracks 3 feet wide were very utilitarian in the mountains. They could go up steep grades, go around sharper curves, be built for less money, and most importantly, could get into mining camps and other attractive places faster than standard or broad gauges could with their tracks 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide. When Palmer returned to the US, he began the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, which was unique in 2 ways. Number one, it was one of the few railroads in US history ever to run north and south. Almost all railroads in the US run east and west. And secondly, it was narrow gauge, something the US hadn't seen much of before. Palmer planned to run the railroad from Denver to Mexico City, north and south, tapping mining towns west of the line and farms east of the line. The Rio Grande began building in 1870 and built straight south to Colorado Springs, where General William Palmer became the father of. Palmer, as a Quaker, didn't like nearby Colorado City because there was a lot of gambling, prostitution, and drinking. So he began a new city, Colorado Springs. Today, Palmer sits on horseback in the middle of Nevada Avenue, and you can go to Palmer High School, Palmer Park, or Palmer Place. Colorado Springs became a haven for the rich, and it became known as Little London or the Newport of the Rockies. Palmer then continued his line further south to Pueblo, where he helped start the Colorado Coal and Iron Company in 1882. Later on, that would be known as the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. If he was going to have a railroad, he'd need steel. From Pueblo, Palmer changed directions and headed west, where the great mining towns like Leadville were beginning to boom. He followed the Arkansas River to the Royal Gorge, which you got a good look at right now with the tracks running down the gorge. On the bottom of the Royal Gorge, there was only room for one set of tracks, and Palmer now ran into trouble. And thus began the Royal Gorge War between 2 railroads, the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe, and the Denver and Rio Grande. They both wanted to lay a track on the bottom of the gorge, but there's only room for one track. You can see people in the Royal Gorge there. They shot at each other. They blew up each other's tracks. And this went on for a couple of years until finally, in 1880, the Boston Treaty was signed. That treaty gave the Rio Grande the right to build through the Royal Gorge, and the Santa Fe got the right to build over Raton Pass into New Mexico. 2 years had passed while the Royal Gorge tied up construction toward Leadville. Palmer's Rio Grande now wasted no time. The narrow gauge built along the Arkansas River to a new town called Salida. That is Spanish for exit. And there is the great Salida Roundhouse, where they serviced railroad engines. On July the 23rd, 1880, William Jackson Palmer's Rio Grande arrived in Leadville, giving that great mining town a railroad which it desperately needed. While waiting to complete that line, the Denver and Rio Grande pushed construction of a branch line over Levita Pass from Walsenburg into the San Luis Valley. In July of 78, it arrived in the new town of Alamosa. The main line of the Rio Grande, however, did not go to Leadville. It headed west from Salida, and there it is, ascending Marshall Pass out of Poncha Springs. And it went over 10,846-foot high Marshall Pass and into the Gunnison country. Construction began in 1880, and by January of 81, 1,100 men and 150 teams were at work on the Gunnison extension. On they built through heavy snow and freezing cold, past little switches with names like Otto and Mears Junction on the east slope. And there you can see a Denver and Rio Grande train ascending Marshall Pass out of Poncha Springs, heading for the top of the pass. And then it got to the top of the pass and went through snow sheds, and then down the west side through Shawano and Buxton before it arrived in Sargent's in the Gunnison country. Now there's a very fanciful drawing of the Rio Grande going down into Sargent's in the Gunnison country. On August the 6th, 1881, the Rio Grande engine Pacific Slope pulled past little switches and came into Gunnison. The Rio Grande engine was called the Pacific Slope. It was the first train ever to arrive in Gunnison. And after a very brief celebration, the Rio Grande headed 28 miles north to Crested Butte, where great coal mines were, and arrived there on November the 21st. And there you get a couple of good pictures of Gunnison in 1882. Main Street. And you can see it's pretty primitive at that time, right after the railroad ride. The main line of the Rio Grande continued now west towards Montrose and Grand Junction. With thousands of workers laying tracks, the Rio Grande entered the dreaded Black Canyon at Saponero and ran 15 miles through it to Cimarron. And at Cimarron, it had to come out. Ripley Hitchcock, a writer for a New York newspaper, was with the Rio Grande in the canyon. And there you see the Black Canyon and the famous Curacandy Needle. And he was on a boarding or hotel train, which was parked on the siding across from the Needle. And he declared, and I quote, "Here was a temporary home of 400 men. Gangs of men were busily unloading and placing ties and rails and leveling the surface. Soon a whistle blew. 6 o'clock had come, and men scrambled aboard the flat cars, and the train made its way back to the hotel on wheels. The men hustled each other like a flock of stampeded sheep in a wild race for supper. There were swarthy Italians, Irishmen with carroty locks, and a score of nationalities, begrimed, tattered, gnawed at, and the appetite given by labor in the bracing Colorado air. They swarmed into the old freight cars, which had been fitted up with long planks for benches and tables. Mounds of coarse bread, pans of strange stew, and pots of black tea appeared and disappeared before these lusty trenchermen. One by one, they rose from the table. Some lighted black pipes, some mended garments, others produced cards. A few climbed into the narrow board bunks in the cars. It was a glimpse of a hardened, cheerless life that I witnessed. But as I turned to go back to the construction train, someone struck up a rollicking Irish song, and others joined in the chorus until the canyon walls gave it back. The Rio Grande, along with the Crested Butte extension, built 2 other branch lines. One in 1883 up the South Arkansas River to the town of Monarch to tap into rich silver discoveries there. Later on, they carried lime. The Rio Grande carried lime from that great limestone quarry that's still there today to the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company steel mills in Pueblo, where it was used in the production of steel. Another good shot of the railroad on Marshall Pass you're looking at. The other branch line ran 36 miles from Saponero on the main line, south to Lake City in 1889. But unfortunately, the silver boom had busted there, and the railroad carried little until shutting down in the 1930s. William Jackson Palmer had a rival in his quest to get to the Gunnison country first. And that rival was Governor John Evans, Denver, South Park, and Pacific Narrow Gauge. Evans, the ex-governor of Colorado Territory, ran his line from Denver over Kenosha Pass at 10,000 feet after coming through Turkey Creek Canyon, and then through the towns of Jefferson, Como, and Fairplay, through South Park, over Trout Creek Pass, and then headed up Chalk Creek, where he assaulted the Continental Divide. Trying to run a railroad over 12,000-foot high Altman Pass was impossible. So Evans instead decided a tunnel underneath the pass, the famous Alpine Tunnel. Thousands of men worked at Atlantic on the east side of the divide, and Pacific, a construction camp on the west side. Few lasted more than a few weeks in the winter, with 40 below zero temperatures and heavy snow. Now, I told you a little wrong earlier, people. That is a South Park train coming out of the Alpine Tunnel and coming out on the west side, and you can see the tunnel entrance about midway in the photo. The tunnel, when completed in 1882, was 1,771 feet long and had snow sheds at both ends. 1,500,000 board feet of timber was used inside the tunnel, which was the highest railroad tunnel in the world at 11,523 feet. When workers met in the middle of the tunnel, they were only 11/100ths of an inch off. The tunnel was built at a slight incline on both sides, so water could flow out on both the Atlantic and the Pacific sides. And there you get a good look at the famous Palisades, because when the South Park came out of the tunnel and ran west, it ran on the side of a cliff. And that tunnel was built out of rocks with no mortar, 450 feet long and 50 feet high. The famous Palisades. From there, it came around Sherrod Curve, past a little silver camp called Woodstock, and then into Pitkin and Parlin, and then Gunnison in 1882. The South Park headed for the booming mining camp of Irwin to the north, but the boom had busted, and the railroad dead-ended 15 miles north of Gunnison at a coal town called Baldwin. On March the 10th, 1884, a great tragedy hit Woodstock, and you're looking at Woodstock. Go back to that one earlier there, one before, if you would. There's Woodstock, ladies and gentlemen, and that is where a great tragedy occurred on March the 10th. A South Park train high above and near the Alpine Tunnel ran through a drift on the tracks. The ramming of the snow caused a huge avalanche to roar down the mountainside, and Woodstock was directly in its path far below. You can see some of the cabins of Woodstock off to the left. The avalanche smashed into the little village, wiping out every building and killing 14 people, including 6 from one family. Woodstock was gone forever. The Denver Rio Grande won the race to be first in the Gunnison country, and that was the death knell for the Great South Park. The last train ran through the Alpine Tunnel in 1910, and the railroad named Desire shut down operations shortly thereafter. The narrow gauge railroads in Colorado were very slow, with top speed at about 9 miles an hour. And this led to such famous sayings as the following: on time, anytime. You didn't want the car to run over you because it was on you for so long. It doubles in, it doubles out, leaving the traveler still in doubt whether the engine on the track is going on or coming back. And then the great story of Finnegan, a wreck on the railroad at Marshall Pass. Finnegan had to write it up, 2 pages. Boss said, I am not reading a lot of material. Next time you have a wreck, boil it down to 1 page or less. 3 months later, another wreck. Finnegan wrote up a 1-page report. The boss said, too long. 3 months later, another wreck. And this time Finnegan said in his report on the wreck to his boss, off again, on again, gone again, Finnegan. And that's about as short as you can make it. And then there was a legendary story of a lady on the train going over Marshall Pass who walked up to the conductor, wagged her finger under his nose and said, can't this damn train go any faster? I'm about ready to have a baby. Conductor, been a long day. Wagged his finger under the nose of the woman and said, madam, you should have thought about this before you get on the damn train. The woman wagged her finger under the conductor's nose and said, I wasn't in this condition when I got on this train. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is a slow train. Meanwhile, in southwestern Colorado, One of the great railroad builders was at work trying to join rich mining camps, and his name was Otto Mears, the famous pathfinder of the San Juan. Otto Mears had initially built toll roads in western Colorado, 12 of them. Saguache to San Juan, Red Mountain Toll Road, Dallas Divide Toll Road, Marshall Pass Toll Road, among others. But now he began to build narrow gauge railroads. His driving aim was to connect the great mining towns of Ouray and Silverton. There was, however, one problem, and that was the fearsome Uncompahgre Canyon on today's $1 million highway, which ran 6 miles out of Ouray, straight up, very narrow, and much too high a grade for a railroad to run. 1,000-foot drops. That road that Otto Mears built a toll road over was called the $1 Million Highway. And they called it the $1 Million Highway because they figured for every mile of road that they built in the Uncompahgre Canyon and towards Silverton, they covered up $1 million worth of ore they might have mined. Not only did you have the Uncompahgre Canyon, you also had 11,018-foot high Red Mountain Pass. The Uncompahgre Canyon was much too steep for a railroad, but Otto Mears tried. He proceeded to build 3 short line railroads in an effort to tie Silverton with Ouray, and they were called the Rainbow Route. And there's a great book by Robert Sloan and Donald Skoronsky called The Rainbow Route, and I would recommend it to anybody. Great photographs, tremendous book. Otto Mears' first narrow gauge railroad was the Silverton Northern, which ran 17 miles north into Ironton Park. And there's a painting of it. And finally to the end of the Uncompahgre Canyon, 18 miles from Silverton, and it couldn't go anymore. The railroad was called the railroad that ran from nowhere to nowhere. It cost $725,000, was finished in 1889, and lasted to 1924. Close to Ouray, but no cigar. And there's the railroad running right by the Yankee Girl Mine up around Ironton Park. And that's Ouray way back down in the background there with the Uncompahgre Canyon plummeting down. Otto Mears was undeterred. He began another narrow gauge railroad, the Silverton Northern. That one ran along the Animas River to the head, 15 miles into the great mining camp of Animas Forks and in the shadows of Engineer and Cinnamon Passes, which took one into Lake City. But there was no way that Mears could build a railroad over Engineer Pass at 12,856 feet or Cinnamon Pass at 12,600, so another failure. Mears made one more try, connecting Ouray with Silverton. He began the Silverton, Gladstone, and Northerly Railroad in 1899. That railroad ran up Cement Creek to the town of Gladstone, past today's Silverton ski area and the Gold King Spill. The Silverton Northern Railroad could go no farther at the base of Engineer and Cinnamon Passes. In 1891, Mears finally found a way to connect Ouray with Silverton, albeit in a roundabout way, with the Rio Grande Southern narrow gauge. The Rio Grande had been built from Montrose to Ouray by the late 1880s, and Mears now used those tracks from Montrose to Ouray to Ridgeway, and then he began to build his famous line. And there it is right there, over Dallas Divide to Placerville, a branch to Telluride, then the Ophir Loop, then past Trout Lake, then over Lizard Head Pass at 10,000 feet, and then to Dolores Cortez and into Durango. And from there, he connected with Palmer's Rio Grande, which ran 45 miles through the Animas River Canyon into Silverton. The Rio Grande had built into Silverton as early as 1882. So Otto Mears, in a piece of masterful evasion, had gone 187 miles out of his way to make that Uraida-Silverton connection with the Rio Grande Southern. And of course, today, 200,000 people ride the Durango to Silverton narrow gauge between Durango and Silverton. One more railroad would add to Colorado's great history. In 1902, David Moffett, one of Colorado's greatest financial and mining men, decided to build the standard gauge Denver, Northwestern, and Pacific. Moffett was a multi-millionaire. He had an interest in the First National Bank of Denver, owned over 100 mines, including those in Cripple Creek and Aspen. And he also owned the Denver Tramway Corporation. Moffett wanted to build a line from Denver to Salt Lake City and eventually out to the West Coast. Capitalized at $20 million. That standard line left Denver and went to Rollinsville and Toland before ascending 11,680 foot high Rollins Pass and dropping into the western slope town of Winter Park. Moffett got to Gore Canyon by 1907, Steamboat Springs on the Yampa River by 1911, and then he had exhausted his fortune because of the enormous expense of building over high passes and through difficult terrain, and because a lot of other railroads didn't want any competition if Moffett would get out to the West Coast. David Moffett never realized his dream of getting the Denver, Northwestern, and Pacific to Salt Lake. He died in 1911. He always believed that in the future, high passes would no longer be needed by his railroad. Tunnels under the passes would take their place. And he was right. 17 years later, in 1928, the Moffett Tunnel was built under Rollins Pass, 6.2 miles long for $18 million. It eliminated 23 miles of track, cut grades to 2%, and eliminated all the great snow problems on top of Rollins Pass. And today, the Transcontinental Railroad Amtrak uses the tunnel as it runs from the West Coast to Denver and then across the nation. Railroads began a slow decline after the silver panic of 1893, with all the great silver towns down and no more traffic for the railroads. And then following World War I also. Traffic declined on the lines, and then came buses and automobiles and air travel. The good times were all gone. During World War II, however, railroads got a short revival, with 80 trains a day going through Union Station in Denver, carrying thousands of troops. After the war, rail traffic declined precipitously, and by the 1950s, rails had been pulled up throughout Colorado, and a great era came to an end. Railroads played a very crucial role in Colorado's development. Without them, the mining, ranching, and farming frontiers wouldn't have existed. They were also the #1 employer in Colorado for a long time. There were also some negatives attached to the railroads. They controlled legislatures, held up towns to get choice spots, and caused an appalling loss of life before automatic couplers and Westinghouse air brakes. The narrow gauge railroads of Colorado also pioneered in many innovations, such as flangers, which fit on top of the track and scrape the ice and snow off, cow catchers, which were on the front of the engine, bumping cows off the track so they wouldn't get under the wheels, snow sheds, and of course the narrow gauge itself. Amtrak, of course, still remains in Colorado, entering from Utah to Grand Junction, then Glenwood Canyon, Moffett Tunnel, Denver, and then through eastern Colorado en route to Chicago. Other railroads today exist as tourist lines. The greatest of that is the Durango-Silverton narrow gauge. Others include Cumbres and Toltec Railroad in southern Colorado. Other one runs from Leadville to near Fremont Pass. There's one in the Royal Gorge, one going from Cripple Creek to Victor. And there, ladies and gentlemen, is part of the famous Georgetown Loop. the Georgetown Loop. They weren't able to go up Clear Creek Canyon and make 638 feet in 3 miles from Georgetown to Silver Plume. So a great engineer named Robert Blixendorfer created 2 gigantic loops, which cut down the grade. And the railroad now ran for 4.7 miles on a lesser grade and made that from Georgetown to Silver Plume. You can still ride it today. Railroads have been immortalized in song. The wreck of the old 97. There's the Georgetown Loop. Casey Jones, Orange Blossom Special, City of New Orleans, and I've been working on the railroad. And it's also immortalized in literature. And some of us who grew up with railroads can still smell the steam. Listen to the track, the wheels on the track. I grew up in Milwaukee, right next to the North Shore line. Remember it very well as a young boy. The lure of the railroads is still in the hearts of many across the nation. And E.J. Haley's Christmas Eve on the Old South Park brings back the memories. And it went like this, talking about the Alpine Tunnel route. A glance on our orders, we see that they say, we must stop for water at Quartz or Midway. The tank on Woodstock must be frozen up tight. I'll bet it's cold on the pass tonight. In my mind's eye, I picture Sherrod's sharp curve, the Palisade shelf, which will test a man's nerve. I say a prayer that no rock lurks neath the snow to send us crashing to the depths far below. The thought of Alpine Tunnel I find not appealing. We'll round East Portal Curve with our flanges a squealing. Down the valley of Chalk Creek so silent and white, past Hancock and St. Elmo and on through the night. As Gilbert Lathrop so eloquently said in his book, the narrow gauge railroads in Colorado were little engines run by big men. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the story of the railroads in Colorado. And incidentally, next week, it's ranching in Colorado. So I will now turn it over to Melinda for a moment or two, and she's going to tell you again how to answer the trivia question, which is on its way.
That is right. It is in the chat box. So look at the bottom of your screen, click on chat, and the first one that answers the question correctly will win a prize from Duane. Are you ready?
It is first come, first serve. This 4.7 mile narrow gauge track up Clear Creek Canyon is the most famous in the nation.
Georgetown Loop.
There it is, Catherine Widener.
Catherine, you are quick.
Catherine, you're going to have to give your email or phone number to Melinda a little later. Yep, we're all asking Georgetown Loop. Folks, we got 261 on board. Thank you all for being on board. And any questions that anybody has on the railroads in Colorado or any comments, feel free to go to the chat box and fill us in.
All right, we have a couple here maybe. Oh, you're welcome, Ashley. I hope you're enjoying South Dakota.
Yeah, there's Ashley, who is our usual person on board. She's out in South Dakota working. Any other questions or comments? Rick, thank you very much. Rick, I don't think there's any connection between Kenosha Pass and Kenosha, Wisconsin. Were most of the narrow gauge railroad tracks torn up when the mines closed? And the answer is yes. Unfortunately, in Gunnison, they took them out in 1955 over Marshall Pass through the Gunnison country. What happened to the Golden Spike? I think it is in the museum at Promontory Point, Utah. We had a question before that.
Yeah, from Annie. Do you see it? Where did the workers usually live when working on the high country narrow gauge railroads?
Well, if you remember in the Black Canyon, they had a hotel on wheels. And they had a couple of railroad cars that were about 2 stories high, and they had board bunks. And all these guys slept on the fly. What was the purpose of the snow shed? The purpose of the snow shed, which was on top of the pass, was to keep snow from drifting and blocking the train when it went through. So they had them, the Alpine Tunnel, of course, was a tunnel, but the snow shed on Marshall Pass, when you approached, you would blow the whistle and they'd open the doors, and then you'd go through and they'd close them again. Yeah, you know, Dave, I didn't have time to get into the Colorado Midland. The Colorado Midland ran from Colorado Springs over Wilkerson and Ute Passes, over Hagerman Pass, down the Frying Pan River, and into Basalt. And then in February of '88, it ran a 19-mile line into Aspen. That was the second one to get into Aspen. The Rio Grande got into Aspen in November of '87 over over Fremont Pass.
I think there was a question prior to that from Phyllis. Was the last rail trip between Gunnison and Crested Butte also in 1955?
You know, Phyllis and Rich, you know better than I don't think so. I think they pulled the tracks out, and I think 52 or 53 when the Crested Butte coal mines closed up, but you guys might know better than I. But I know there were no trains running in 55.
All right, Mark Walker asks, how about John Henry and Working on the Railroad? What were the most famous railroad songs?
Yeah,
we should hear a song.
John Henry, yes. And then
I think
there was another song called Big Bad John.
Ooh, that's a good
Yeah,
one.
a lot of great railroad songs. Any other questions or comments?
Oh, there's a few more. We have one from, Jennifer. How was Otto Mears funded for all his lines?
He pretty much funded himself. And he made money by carrying silver and gold. And, you know, early with his toll gates and toll roads, he made a lot of money. And if you ever go out of Ouray, about 4 miles out of Ouray, come to the Bear Creek toll gate, and no way you're going through that area without paying the toll. So he did make a lot of money while times were good. And then he wound up going in Chesapeake Bay area, and he lost a lot of money there. And 1928, he was 88 years old. He wanted to come back to Silverton, and his doctor said, "You're not going." He said, "I am going." And he did go, and his doctors asked him why he was going at that age. He said, "I want to say goodbye to some old friends in Silverton." When he died, he asked that his ashes be scattered over Engineer Pass, but they couldn't get there, so they scattered him over Bear Creek Falls. He died at 91 in 1931. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, just a few more. Douglas says, greetings from our cabin, the Eldora Station, the last remaining station on the Switzerland Trail of America.
Wow. Wow, thank you for that.
A question, what is the best tourist train trip to take in Colorado today?
You know, there are a lot of great ones. Boy, the Georgetown Loop is only 4.7 miles. That's tough to beat. Durango and Silverton's tough to beat. Antonito to Chama is tough to beat. It's kind of what you're looking for. They are all great.
All right. Thanks, Catherine, for that question. And we have Keith, big boy, Union Pacific's pride and joy. Monster steam locomotive came down from the Cheyenne route last week to Denver. Just wanted to clear up an earlier comment.
Wow. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think we have one more in the Q&A here. Any info on R&R route from CF&I to the Mines of Trinidad area?
You know, the Rio Grande and the Santa Fe both wanted to get into Trinidad, and they wanted to get into Trinidad because that's where the coal was. That is near Raton Pass, and that also was on the old Santa Fe Trail. So the Santa Fe got there, I think, in 1876, but Trinidad was a real key spot. You know, one thing for you railroad buffs, when you go through South Park, if you stop at Como, you got to get off the road a little bit, about half a mile in. The Denver South Park Association is laying track. They got the turntable working, and it's fantastic. And he says anything about the Galloping Goose and Telluride. Yes, in the 1930s, when things really hit the skids, they put a Pierce Arrow automobile frame powered by an 80 horsepower Buick engine, and they could pull about 2 cars, not railroad cars, but just, smaller cars. And they would carry cows and hay and so on. And the reason they called it a Galloping Goose was that the automobile wheels, rims would not fit very well on the railroad tracks. So the left wheel would hit the left rail and ricochet. And then the right wheel would hit the right rail and ricochet. And the thing went down the track, breaking a lot of axles like a galloping goose. Hence the name Galloping Goose.
That's pretty good.
Any other questions or comments? If not, it's been great. And I hope to see all of you next week when we're going to get into ranching and the great Walter Prescott Webb writing about the Great Plains. Yeah, thank you, Andy. Thank you, Catherine. Any other comments you want to put them in. Barb, thanks. Mark, thanks. Yeah, thanks, folks. Thanks, Cindy. Carol, thank you. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in and the kind comments.
Yeah.
I will hope to see everybody next week. So
Thank you,
Vandensbusche.
Duane. You have been amazing. I just want to thank our sponsors one more time. The Western Colorado University Foundation, Bill Petros, and Bud with Bluebird. Duane, this has been a fabulous one. I'm so happy to be here tonight with you, and I think you're fantastic. So thanks again for all your support to the community and to everyone who has came on board to watch your fantastic talk about railroads.
Thank you, Melinda. Thanks for doing a great job with me this week. All right, everybody. We'll see you next Thursday. Bye.